Hey folks, welcome back to Canada's Boxing Channel. And this is another one in the series where we look back at great fighters from the past. Most of the people we've looked back on have been world champions. Well, one of the exceptions, of course, was George Chuvalo, the great Canadian fighter who never won a world title. This time, we're looking back at one of my all-time favourite British fighters. He was a hero of mine growing up when I was a child, and he was beloved by the British public. The only person to ever be knighted by the Queen for services to boxing, none other than the owner of Enry's Ammer, the great Sir Henry Cooper. A lot of accolades about Henry Cooper, both inside and outside of the ring. Inside the ring, he reigned for 12 years as British heavyweight champion, 3 years as European champion, and he won the Lonsdale belt outright 3 times, a feat that nobody else has ever done. He got the OBE in 1969, and like I say, he was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen in the year 2000. Henry Cooper was, like many of the fighters we look back on, born into, if not poverty, certainly impoverished circumstances. He was born in 1934 in London, and he lived in a council estate in London. And of course, the Blitz started in 1940 when he was just a little baby child. He was 6 years old. And like many of the children of that time, they were evacuated to the countryside. So that was a traumatic start to this young Henry Cooper's life, right? He had a twin brother, who boxed under the name of Jim. Not quite as good a boxer as Henry, but Jim, whose real name was George, was a twin brother, and there was an older brother as well. And his mum's name was Lily, and his dad was Henry Sr. He had 13 amateur fights. He got into all sorts of sports, but boxing was his favorite. He got into amateur boxing, had 13 amateur fights with a record of 9-4, and represented Great Britain at the Olympics in 1952 in Helsinki. In 1954, he turned pro, and he was managed by Jim Wicks, a very famous boxing name from those times. He was always cut prone, and Henry Cooper was not what we would now say defensively blessed. But he had one real sort of secret weapon, and that's the aforementioned big left hook, Enry's Ammer. And interestingly, though he boxed in an orthodox style, he was naturally a left-handed person. So his lead hand was actually his strongest hand. So he was able to get that power punch in from his strongest hand in a way that a lot of orthodox fighters, of course, wouldn't. You know, normally your strongest hand is your backhand, right? Cooper had it the other way round. Now, in 1955, after his first 9 fights as a pro, he won. Then he takes a loss. Then he has a couple of more wins, and then he starts this rivalry with the solid Welsh boxer from Cardiff, Joe Erskine. Now, their first fight was 1955. It was a title eliminator for the British title, which Cooper lost on points. And they next met then in 1957 for the British and Commonwealth titles. Erskine outweighed Cooper by about 10 pounds and again won a points win over the distance. But when they met again in 1959, the power shots landed from Henry, and they did make a difference. Cooper stopped Erskine in the 12th round after dropping him twice with the hammer. And that was his first, major championship. And if you go back and look at the fight, Erskine is essentially unconscious, draping over the ropes, and it's a TKO. Their rivalry continued with bouts in 1961 and 62, which were both won by Henry Cooper. And that solidified his status as one of Britain's top heavyweights. During the 1950s period, Cooper also beat Dick Richardson, Zora Foley, which might be one of his best wins. He won one and he lost one. And he also beat Brian London, who was another very well-known British heavyweight at that time. Unfortunately, he lost to the future world champion Ingemar Johansson for the European title in 57. 57 was actually a bad year for for Cooper, who lost each of his 3 fights that year. And again, it shows his resilience. We talked today about a fighter who he's lost. He's going to be on the trash or whatever. No, back in these days, you won some, you lost some, you won some, and you carried on, right? And again, it shows to me character, that you can lose fights in a row and come back and then ascend great heights, which Cooper undoubtedly did. So winning the Lonsdale belt outright, he won the British title, of course, defending it successfully 3 times to claim the Lonsdale belt outright. That's a great achievement. But Cooper did it not just once, twice, but 3 times. So that dominated his place in British boxing history. Between 1959 and 1969, he was undoubtedly the dominant British heavyweight of that decade. He turned back all challengers and he set a record that I do believe to this day still stands. No other British heavyweight has got 3 Lonsdale belts outright. If I've made a mistake on this, please correct me in the comment section. But to the best of my knowledge, that's a record that has not been beaten by anybody else. Now, as dominant as Henry Cooper was on the domestic scene, the truth of the matter is, whenever he stepped up to real world level, he wasn't quite there. I mean, there was also, of course, at this time, some great boxers at this world level. So, you always look things, relative to who else was fighting at the time, right? So he'd established himself by the time I was born, he'd established himself as one of Britain's best. But of course, the world stage was different. Now we often think of the best of the British fighters as being the best in the world, which, with the exception of Alexander Usyk, they generally are. That wasn't the case then. In 1963, he faced the young, up-and-coming, charismatic, telegenic, trash-talking Muhammad Ali. And this was before Ali changed his name, so Ali was actually called Cassius Clay at the time. Ali became Cassius Clay after his victory over Sonny Liston. But I'm just going to use the name Muhammad Ali throughout. So, in the 4th round of this fight, Cooper did something that nobody expected. Because remember, Ali in 63 he's not quite hit his peak, but he's doing something that no other heavyweights have ever done. As I've said in a previous video, he's the heavyweight version of Sugar Ray Robinson. He's dancing, he's moving, he's showboating is the term we would use today, right? And nobody was thinking that Henry Cooper was going to pose any problems to this young American superstar in the making. Well, in the 4th round, Ali did something. I believe Ali glanced at Elizabeth Taylor, who was a movie star, and she was sitting just in the front row, and he just glanced for a second to look at her, and then boom, Enry's Ammer put him on his ass. And this was an absolute upset. I strongly encourage you to go and look at the film. The bell saved Ali, because there's no doubt that Ali was not going to be able to get it. Oh, well, we say no doubt. I don't think that Ali would have gotten up, but he was saved by the bell. And then there was some clever kind of stalling tactics by Angelo Dundee. There's a lot of mythology about this, but the best as I can figure is that there was a small little tear in Ali's glove that suddenly became a little bit bigger, and they had to get a replacement glove. Now, you will read in some places that this was a long delay, that they had to go back to the dressing room and all that. That's not true. A glove was produced very, very quickly. Ali did not get a lot of time, but it was a little bit of time. And seconds count, right? When you're trying to clear your head, seconds count. So Ali was given a little bit more time to recuperate. And when the fight resumed, Cooper's tendency to cut easy, he used to cut terribly over his eyes. proved his downfall, and the bout was stopped in the 5th round. Now, despite the loss, Cooper's stock rose, and 3 years later in '66 he was given a world title shot against Ali. But once again the cuts opened another stoppage. And Ali famously said after that fight, "Man, I could hear him bleeding." And if you go and look at that fight, Cooper's face is a mess, and there's blood all down his chest and everything. It looks like he's gone through the windshield of a car. And that was always Cooper's downfall. He was so easily cut, and it really sort of was deleterious to his success as a boxer. He was just so easily cut. It was almost like he had tissue above his eyes. That same year, in 1966, he also fought against former heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson. Patterson's speed, Patterson's experience gave Cooper problems, and Patterson took the win in the 4th round by a KO. And to quote my father, who was himself a boxer, he said many, many times to me, I can hear him as though he was still sitting here with me now. A good two-hander will always beat a good one-hander. Those are pretty wise words. And it showed that there was levels, that Cooper had been this domestic level, dominant force, but when stepping up to take on the best of the Americans, he came short. And famously, he never fought against people like Sonny Liston. In fact, he said himself that he wasn't interested in fighting Sonny Liston, which just goes to show how ferocious and fearsome Sonny Liston was. Henry Cooper was not the only person to take a look at Sonny Liston and say, not for me. He's a sensible guy, to be perfectly honest with you. So while the success at this world level eluded Cooper, he remained dominant in Britain. His most notable domestic rivalries his most notable domestic rivalries was with Jack Bodell, who was 6 years younger than him, about the same height. But unlike Erskine, who was a really slick boxer, Bodell was an awkward, unorthodox, southpaw, and it was very, very frustrating for opponents to deal with. And their first encounter in 1967 saw Cooper, however, stop Bodell in 2 rounds. In their 1970 rematch, Cooper, who was now nearing the end of his career, remember Cooper's born in '34, right? Proved he was still the king of the British heavyweights, albeit at this time with a points win over the full 15-round distance, and then to defend his British and Commonwealth heavyweight championship. Cooper had 2 fights remaining. One was a KO over the rugged Spaniard Jose Manuel Urtain to retain the European title, and then the fight I will personally remember forever, his 1971 loss to Joe Bugner. Now, Cooper he was 37 years old, had said, win, lose or draw, I'm going to retire. He knew that he was near the end of his career, and in those days, 37 was an old heavyweight. I mean, we know now that boxers are fighting until their 40s, though with variable success. Everybody wants to be George Foreman, but few are. But 37 then was old. And remember, he had a lot of fights, and many of those fights were 15-round fights. Though unlike a lot of boxers, Henry Cooper wasn't cognitively or visibly cognitively impaired by his fights. He used to complain about a touch of arthritis. That was about all he would complain about. So anyhow, in 1971, Henry Cooper, who was, of course, at this, the end of his career, it's a win, lose or draw, I'm going to retire. He had this one last fight, and it was to defend his British, European, and Commonwealth titles. So everything was on the table. And he was facing the young, big, blonde-haired, good-looking, new kid on the block, the just turned 21 years old Joe Bugner. Now, Joe Bugner was 16 years younger than Cooper, 23 pounds heavier than Cooper and 3 inches taller than Cooper. It was a really, really brutal 15-round war. Henry Cooper felt that he had nicked it by a couple of rounds. Most people watching the fight felt that he had done enough to retain his titles. And it would have been the right decision for the referee, Gibbs, to have awarded the decision to him. But Harry Gibbs awarded the decision to Joe Bugner by 1/4 of a point. 73.5 points to Henry Cooper, 73.75 points to Joe Bugner. Now, Harry Gibbs had to be escorted out of the arena by the police. This was the most controversial decision imaginable. People were up in arms about it. And I remember my mum was crying the next day. I think she had the Sun or the Daily Mirror, I don't remember which, and reading about it. My mum was in tears. Like people were invested in Henry Cooper. He was. If you were there, you know what I'm talking about. If you weren't there, it's really, really hard to explain. But Henry Cooper embodied so much about that people consider to be, sort of typical of British pluck and determination. He was the man who'd put Ali down. He'd gone to war with the top Americans, and his demeanor when he was beaten was so gentlemanly. You'll see that he's been in some of his fights. He's not been awarded the win, and he's shucks. Like no tantrums. This is a man who embodied a lot of what people thought of as that sort of the wartime spirit. It was different times, really hard to explain. If you've lived through them, you will know what I'm talking about, and hopefully I'm doing a pretty good job of trying to convey that feeling. I mean, my dad was absolutely livid. I don't think I'd ever seen my dad so mad. He was apoplectic at this decision, right? These are ordinary working people living in terraced houses who were outraged at this decision. Now, I think it was a terrible decision for Henry Cooper, and I think it was an even worse decision for Joe Bugner. And I say this because Joe Bugner was from that moment on hated at first, and then sort of just not treated well or properly by the British public. Now, it didn't help that he was born in Hungary. These days, we wouldn't think a thing about that. But in those days, he was a bloody foreigner. He wasn't a real Englishman. And again, different times. But there was an absolute degree of animus towards Joe Bugner, who'd done nothing wrong. Joe Bugner fought a great fight to beat a legendary champion. It wasn't his fault that he won by 1/4 point, but he was never treated the same. And in fact, in the 1980s, he emigrated to Australia. And I often think that had he lost to Cooper, and Cooper had retired, Bugner would have been embraced as the new prince of British boxing. And, he would have gone on, he would have beaten, a Bodell or somebody like that. And he would have been the new king. But because of the way in which he won against Henry Cooper, he never really was properly embraced. And I think that's a tragedy. I think Joe Bugner turned out to be a very, very, very good fighter. He went 15 rounds with Ali twice, remember? So it was just a bad thing all round. Now, Henry Cooper never really forgave Harry Gibbs. In fact, he alluded to some dishonesty in a book once, and he got sued by Gibbs. And it wasn't until 1999 that they actually met and shook hands. And I don't think that Cooper ever really forgave Gibbs for that. Was it a robbery? I don't know. I've seen the fight so many times. It's hard to separate my emotion from, what I now see, it was a close fight. There's an argument for it to have gone either which way. But regardless, Henry Cooper stuck to his word. He retired, and he remained a beloved figure in British sport. He became a popular TV personality. If some of you might remember, there was a TV show called The Superstars, where you had David Emery, Henry Cooper himself, and latterly then John Conte. They all took part in these. It's sort of like a decathlon of events for TV. It was a good TV show. I watched it lots. He was very popular on that. He was a boxing pundit. He made a TV spot, one of the first TV spots, about encouraging people to get a flu shot, and it was a get your jab in first. I mean, it was a catchy thing, and he had books out about how to keep fit. If you're out of breath trying to catch the bus, you might want to consider walking, getting more exercise in, carrying shopping bags. He was the everyday man who gave common sense advice to people about keeping fit at a time when nobody was out running on the streets unless you were a boxer in training or you were running from somebody, right? This is pre the modern era. And of course, who can forget the splash it all over Brute ads? Brute was for those of you who don't know, Brute was an aftershave. It stunk to the high heavens. But Henry Cooper endorsed it. And so people like me go into the disco or whatever, putting this stuff on, hoping to attract girls. Because if Henry Cooper wore it, it had to be good, right? It was a great time. In the 1990s, unfortunately, he got into financial difficulties. Lloyd's of London, of which he was a name, so with unlimited liability, got into difficulty, and Henry Cooper was, I don't know if he was bankrupted, but he was certainly financially stressed, and he had to sell his Lonsdale belts. And it's to the character of the man that this financial tragedy, causing him to have to sell his most prized possessions, how he handled that showed great resilience. He said, well, yes, it's, sad to lose the belts, but my name is going to be on them forever. And I think there's a BBC TV documentary I remember seeing where he's speaking about this, and you just can't help but take your hat off to the man. I mean, just class and character. At a time when, of course, sports people just did not make anywhere near the kind of money that sports people are making today. As I mentioned at the beginning, he received various honours, most notably, of course, his knighthood. And so from 2000 onwards, he was known as Sir Henry Cooper. He passed away in 2011, but there's no doubt that certainly among British fans, his memory will live on. He wasn't just a boxer, he was a national icon. His rivalries with Joe Erskine and Jack Bodell, and then, of course, the famous fight with Joe Bugner, his battles with Muhammad Ali, I think those cement his place in history. Is he overrated, underrated? To be honest, when people talk about Henry Cooper, they probably, if you're a fan of Henry Cooper like me, you probably overrate him. His record was 40, 14 and 1. And every time he stepped right up, he wasn't successful. But he was more than his record would suggest. So it's his work after boxing, the character he displayed in the ring, all those things put together make Henry Cooper one of my favorite fighters. So I find it hard to sort of say that he was overrated. If you're an American or you're not, or from some other part of the world, and you're not familiar with Henry Cooper, and you look at his record, you're thinking, okay, well, yeah, it was good, but but he was a man of his times. I think that's how I would probably best describe him. Beloved, absolutely. Came close to achieving the impossible back in '63 with Ali, and just a great human being. One of my favorites So I've really enjoyed speaking about him. I've scratched the surface. You know, he had other fights with people I've not mentioned. And I strongly encourage you to go and read about Henry Cooper. Find some good documentaries out there about his life and his times. And if after that, like me, you think he was just a legendary fighter, that would be a good thing, right? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. If there's some fighters that you, particularly heavyweight fighters from yesteryear, that you think that we could talk about, I'm happy to talk about. As you know, I love talking about the fighters from particularly, my childhood and prior to the time I was born. Let's not forget these great fighters, okay? Let's not let promoters and modern day people gaslight us into believing that here now in 2025 we're watching the best that's ever walked into the ring, because that's not true. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. Thanks everybody. Cheers. Bye-bye.